Hey, welcome or welcome back. In today's video, I'm going to be showing how I structure a couple different poses and what shapes that I use, and also showing a little bit of the refining process. This video is going to be a little bit more laid back. I won't say it's a tutorial, but I do think it may help some people, so yeah, let's get into the shapes. So starting out, I'm starting with the head shape. If you've seen my last video about simple faces, I explained how I draw faces from the front view, and that will help you understand how I draw heads here. And once I have the head, I like to move on next to the neck. So for the neck, I like to think of the neck as a rectangle or a cylinder, though it is best to shade like the neck is a cylinder. Next is the torso. So for the torso, I like to use a oval, and I like to think of it as a 3D oval shape. And then for the shoulders, I like to use circles. I attach those circles to the torso at the top, and that just helps me figure out where to place the shoulders on the body, and usually they're even with each other. Next is the center line, and that just helps me figure out which way the torso is facing. And then for the hips, I like to draw a rectangle. This rectangle can also be thought of 3D and as a box. Next is the arms. I like to break the arms down into two cylinders. First, the upper cylinder is the upper arm, and then the bottom cylinder is a little bit different. It just kind of tapers inward towards where the wrist would be. That's the main difference between the two. One just tapers inward, and this just helps me differentiate what area is what on the arms. And then going back to the hips, sometimes I like to draw this kind of underwear shape just to help me figure out which way the hips are going, or if I find it to just be more easier for a certain pose. And then for the thighs, I like to think of those as cylinders as well, that also slightly taper inwards going down towards the knees. Next, for the hands, I like to use a rectangle for the palm, a trapezoid for the fingers, and a little rectangle for the thumb. Doing the hands this way starting off just helps me figure out which way they need to go. And then I like to draw an arc inside of the torso, and this just represents the rib cage, and it also helps me figure out which way the upper body is facing. On top of the shoulders, I like to connect a line from the neck to the shoulders. But those are all the shapes that I use for these poses. I haven't studied the lower body as much. I'm still working on the upper body, so this is what I've learned so far. But now we can move on to the first pose. So with this pose, I decided to start with the head. With this pose, I noticed that she's looking to the left, so I make sure to draw the head facing towards the left. And then I go ahead and start adding in the shapes. First is the representation of the neck, which is a rectangle. Then I draw the torso, and I basically just kind of move things around until I feel like they look like they're the right size. I add in the shoulders on each side, and I try to make sure they're even. The triangles that those lines end up making are the trapezius muscles, and they just make like little triangles, and they're really prominent in this pose, so I make sure to include those. Then I kind of start an indication of the lines for the arms, and now I move on to the hips or the pelvis, and I just draw a rectangle. Sometimes I make the rectangles a little bit more curved, and that's just something that I do sometimes. And I add in the indication for the rib cage, and sometimes I have to make the hips a little bit bigger too. I try to keep them about as wide as the body at the top, and then the waist will go in a little bit. Then I kind of drew the underwear shape a little bit just to kind of see where the other body parts might fall. And then I finish off the cylinders for the arms, and her arms are basically kind of pointing inwards, and she's holding her hand. With the general pose, I end up kind of just having the hands floating in the middle around kind of these sides, and I end up changing that later on when I go ahead and refine things. but I'm just kind of getting the general shape and pose of everything that's going on. And then as I sit there and observe everything, I just make small adjustments to kind of just follow what I see in the picture. And this just takes practice. Next, I do the hands. Again, I kind of made them like float first and then I'll fix them later. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult trying to get the arms and hands to sit where you want to, so I like to start off with these sketches really rough and then kind of start refining. And we're actually in the refining process right now. So I decided to screen record this because it was a lot easier for me at the time. But as you can see, I've added in some facial features, the silhouette for the hair and clothing, and a little bit of shading too. And you see I'm kind of fixing the hands now so that they overlap, adding in some kind of indication for fingers. It's very rough. And then I do a lot of refining, cleaning up lines, redrawing things over and over until it starts to look like the pose. At this point, there's just a minor adjustment with the hands. I just make them a little bit bigger because they were smaller, and I pretty much just fix them up until they look like this. But yeah, this is pretty much how she turned out. I feel like I did a decent job on the pose and captured her likeness. So for the next pose is a little bit more complex because her arm is sticking outward and it's kind of foreshortened. But again, I start with the head with this one. And I try to pay attention to how her head is tilted, and I eventually adjust that until I feel like it looks similar to the photo. But again, starting with the rectangle for the neck. So you'll see the circles are at two different heights and the body is curving towards the left. So that's something I like to indicate with that center line. I'll curve it whichever direction that the body is going. And I try to make the shapes also follow that same curve. As you can see, the torso is sort of curving towards the left. Then I made the rib cage line, and that kind of is shifted towards the left as well. And you'll see that I draw the hips going towards the same direction. So trying to get that flow is something that kind of helps your poses not look as stiff. I'm still practicing with this because it's kind of difficult. I still feel like my poses end up looking a little bit stiff, so that's something that I'm actively working on. So with drawing this foreshortened arm, I tried to draw it similar to the picture, but I'm not really studying foreshortening, and I kind of mentioned this in another video where I'm sketching like this, but it's very difficult. I know there's something about like where you can overlap the circles and basically connect lines on the sides of the circles to try to get things to look foreshortened, but it's just really difficult. So yeah. And then the other arm was kind of tucked behind her, as you can see, and I had to adjust the shoulder and pull it in a bit because hers is like really almost behind her body. And then I like to sometimes draw in these shirts and things like that because it helps me see the length of the shirt and torso and everything else. With this drawing, I'm in the refinement stage now, and I'm kind of just showing a little bit more because in the last one I didn't show as much, but drawing in the face, the hair, and just like simple shapes to kind of start. And then after I have those simple shapes, I refine and make things look a lot neater and like the picture. So here I just kind of pushed her face down a little bit to match the photo, and yeah, that's pretty much how she turned out. Next, this one is a sitting pose. So yeah, this was probably the second hardest pose that I still struggle with. I'm not great with sitting poses, but I feel like this one turned out okay enough to kind of show a little bit of my process of how I do that. But again, in this pose, she's looking to the left, so I make sure to draw her head that way, just like the last one. And her neck is a little bit longer, so I try to make her neck a little bit longer. And again, I noticed these shoulders were at different heights. So I'm kind of just showing that with the arrows there. And again, I'm basically just trying to get the gesture down for the pose. This one also kind of curves to the left, like the body curves to the left. So I'm doing a similar thing to the last pose. Only thing with this one is instead of using the rectangular shape for the hips or the pelvis, I decided to go with that kind of underwear shape. And it's pretty rough starting off. I just am trying my best to get it to work because, again, I struggle with this type of pose. But it's best to kind of think of things in shapes that you can kind of put together and construct like Legos, if that makes sense. So once I have a underwear shape that's kind of close to how she looks, I'll add on the legs or the thighs, which are cylinders. So that's what I'm doing, and yeah. With this pose, you can tell her weight is like really shifted towards the right, like her weight is like leaning towards the right, but her body kind of curves to the left, if that makes sense. So yeah. And now I'm doing the arms. So the upper arm kind of goes backwards, and then the lower forearm comes forward. And so I'm just trying to show that with the cylinders, and the hand kind of hangs downward. So instead of using a rectangle, I kind of use just kind of that blocky shape. I'm not really sure what to call it. It's almost like a triangle. Now I'm doing the other arm. This arm was more stretched out and a little bit more straight, so I just kind of paid attention to where the arm folds, and that's where I broke the arm into the second piece. Now I'm kind of looking at her collarbones. So that's something else to kind of see which shoulder is lifting up and which shoulder is kind of like straight or squared off. Basically, if it's going up, the collarbone's gonna kind of look like it's curving downward more. And now I'm drawing in the elbow. So the elbow, I kind of will just kind of look at the picture for and then figure out how I want to construct that or draw that. But now, as you may have guessed, we are in the refinement stage again. So I kind of skipped forward on this one because it's the same thing as the other ones. I basically just clean up the lines and make things look a lot neater, and I'm just showing a little bit of that. And that's pretty much it. I darkened things, I darkened certain areas, I drew in the face and the hair and the hands, and yeah, that's pretty much how she turned out. Next we have the last pose, and again I started with the head with this one. This pose was not as, I wouldn't say it would be as difficult if it wasn't for the way that the arm is that is holding the owl. So that is what made this pose really difficult for me because I've never drawn a forearm in that direction. But for the torso, again, I draw an oval, and from this angle, some people kind of use two ovals to represent the bottom and the top part of the body. And that might just help you figure out the angle of where to put the rectangle or the underwear shape, whatever you choose to use if you decide to do this way. But just kind of overlapping those two ovals together helps me figure out where to put the hips. But now we're on to the shoulders. So one of the shoulders is going to be slightly cut off just because it's behind a little bit and on the other side of the body. But now I'm drawing the arm, and it's similar to the last pose where the upper arm goes backwards and then the forearm kind of comes forward because it is bent. So it's kind of a similar pose in that sense. And here I'm on to the second arm. So it starts off pretty normal, and then the way the forearm is kind of curving is what I was trying to capture. So that was difficult, and the way the hand is pointing towards the camera or like the view that we see it from, that was also really difficult. along with the other hand because all you really see are knuckles. But for now, I just kind of added in a regular hand to just get the general idea of where the hand will be sitting. Here I'm just blacking out everything and trying to figure out where little owl sits. I didn't have to draw that, but I kind of wanted to. And now we're kind of into the refinement stage. I really struggle with this one, and so I kind of just went back and forth with it a lot. Essentially, the forearm is still a cylinder, and I just tried to, for the hand, make it look like the picture as best as I could. That was very difficult for me, but I think I got it to look okay in the end, and as well as the other hand too, which is mainly just knuckles. But this is pretty much how everyone turned out. I decided to just kind of put everybody on one page and see how it looks together. I hope this video was helpful in some kind of way. This was not really a tutorial, but I thought it might be helpful. So yeah, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.